Hello. Welcome to the 11th gathering in Istanbul for freedom of expression, but unfortunately not to Istanbul physically. For many reasons to be explained in these 2 days, we are no more able to hold this traditional meeting in Istanbul this year. Anyway, the world is smaller than yesterday, and thanks to the internet, we are together once again. Unfortunately not live, yet the messages from all around the world and Turkey are here for you to watch on the video. First, let us remember the 21 years long history of the gatherings. We didn't have an intention for such an international meeting. In 1995, a great case with 184 accused was opened against us who wanted to support our great author Yaşar Kemal because of an article he wrote criticizing the behavior of the state on Kurds. On the very first hearing day, we received a supporting message organized by the Writers in Prison Committee of PEN International, signed by many authors from all over the world, including Arthur Miller, Harold Pinter, Susan Sontag, Paul Auster. We diverted this message to the prosecutor, but he did not include them to the case. Then we invited the signers to Istanbul. 1997, March 10 to 12, a group of 21 writers, PEN executives, and human rights defenders came to Istanbul, not only to challenge the judiciary, but also meet our writers as well. It was a series of meetings with writers, journalists, lawyers, and academics. From 1997 to 2018, a very long time passed. We still keep this international gathering every second year. It will be the 11th one now. We want to share this happiness with our dear friends who are unfortunately not among us anymore.
Many of us here in America are saddened and bewildered by the Turkish government's actions which suppress ideas and thoughts. It seems to us that there is no future in such attempts, that from China to Russia to Romania to Serbia and South Africa, a new spirit is gathering strength in the world now. A spirit which absolutely refuses to abandon the right to speak its mind freely and without a government license. What strange creatures we are. We allow ourselves to freely dance on the moon and plumb the depths of the seas with no restraints. But to stand in a city and publish certain words and phrases can cost us our liberty and even our lives. I believe that this irony belongs to the past, not the future. The future will be mastered and enjoyed only by the free.
I'd like to express my total support for everyone meeting in Istanbul today, all those writers, musicians, artists, lawyers, who are determined to protect those freedoms that are being extremely threatened by the authorities in Turkey. I know I'm not alone in this. I know they have the support from all such people, all writers, all over the world, all intellectuals. And we admire what you're doing greatly. I'm very sorry that I can't be with you today myself, but I send you very, very best wishes and all solidarity.
Freedom of expression is as important as the freedom to breathe. When we breathe, we talk. When we talk, we have to breathe. And we should be allowed to talk and write and televise and do what we wish without government interference.
Bir gün dahi ceza alırsam yaşamam, giderim. Öbür türlüsü şerefsizliktir. Yani beraber yaşadığınız insanlara tahkir, tezif edeceksiniz ve beraber yaşayacaksınız. Bu benim karakterim değil.
Sevgili dostlar, ne yazık ki bu ilki toplantılarınızda değilim. Geçen defa birlikteydik. Fakat bu defa hastalığımdan dolayı aranızda değilim. Lütfen kusuruma bakmayın. Türkiye'nin gizli iktidar odağı, sivil ve askeri bürokrasi, Saltın Yelkovanı'nı geriye çevirmek için büyük bir gayret içinde. Ve durmadan azgın, akıl almaz bir militarizm, şövenizm, milliyetçilik pompalanıyor. Ve bu arada tabii düşünce özgürlüğü, insan hakları, Kürtlerin demokratik hakları, azınlıkların kendisini ifade özgürlüğü ayaklar altına alınıyor, çiğneniyor. Biz her halükarda militarizme, ultramilliyetçiliğe, tahammülsüzlüğe ve ötekileştirmeye karşı olmak durumundayız. Ben bir edebiyat yazarıyım. Ama iyi bir edebiyatın da ancak bu söz konusu ilkelerle, prensiplerle ve duyguyla, ruh haliyle yaratılabileceğine inanan bir insanım. Size başarılar diliyorum. Saygılarımı, sevgilerimi gönderiyorum. Umarım bir dahaki toplantıda yine birlikte olacağız.
Welcome once again. Today, in the first day of the 11th gathering, we have high-profile guests from international institutions and NGOs to discuss the situation of freedom of expression around the globe, tendencies, threats, and opportunities. Our guests are free to comment on Turkey or not. The question is very short and clear. Quo vadis? Where are we going?
18 months ago, I visited Turkey on an official mission as the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression. It was only months after the attempted coup, which took the lives of many in a terrible attack on democratic life in Turkey, something that Turks across the political spectrum acknowledged as wrong. I visited Silivri prison and Bakırköy women's prison, where I was denied the ability to see many detainees, such as Aslı Erdoğan, Ahmet and Mehmet Altan, Kadri Gürsel, Murat Sabuncu, Turan Günay, and Musa Kart. I remember sitting with several men in Silivri prison, held merely because of their work with Cumhuriyet, some only the lawyers for the newspaper. I remember sitting at Bakırköy with Necmi Alpay, who explained the failure of the government even to articulate the reason for her detention. Even then, we were all extremely concerned about the actions taken under existing law and the state of emergency decrees. I met with journalists, writers, artists, lawyers, academics, politicians, and representatives of non-governmental organizations. I met with government officials as well. I saw the despair so many people felt, the closing of space for expression and opinion, whether political, journalistic, artistic. In the time since, it has only become more difficult. Trials have led to convictions. Convictions mean commitment to prison for years. On the basis of what? Expression, reporting, dissent, lawyering. We have the Constitutional Court step in to seek to alleviate the lack of rule of law, only to be rejected by criminal courts. We see members of civil service denied their livelihoods based on loose accusations and associations, not wrongdoing. We see a terrible redefinition of journalism as terrorism. We see the broad misuse of laws against extremism, not even defined, but used against activists and others. We see Turkish citizens denied access to fundamental sources of information in the digital age, such as Wikipedia. Enough of these attacks on fundamental rights. The time for repression should have ended long ago. We need to see concrete steps to return Turkey to the democratic path, the path of human rights and rule of law. That means, at the very least, releasing all detained for reasons of exercising freedom of expression, ending the state of emergency, repealing the broad laws against extremism that give the government discretion to arrest and imprison at will, a return of all the media outlets wrongfully taken from their publishers, a reinvigoration of space for artistic freedom. It's not too late for change. It's not too late for Turkey. The international community, the human rights mechanisms of the United Nations, and regional forums across Europe remain with Turkey, with the people of Turkey, and with all those fighting for fundamental human rights.
This cornerstone of democratic checks and balances, protected by Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, is today challenged and undermined from multiple directions. The number of violations reported to the Council of Europe's platform to promote the protection of journalism and safety of journalists has not ceased to grow. Physically, attacks on journalists have increased. Last year, 5 journalists were killed in the Council of Europe region, and well over 100 were reported to be deprived of their liberty, a vast majority of them in Turkey. My latest report on the state of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law also found that the arbitrary shutdown of media organizations, the subjective blocking of online content, and problems related to the lack of transparency of media ownership are also on the increase. I am particularly concerned with regard to the situation in Turkey, and notably with the fact that so many journalists, members of parliament, mayors, and human rights defenders are deprived of their liberty. In July 2016, the Council of Europe was swift to condemn the attempted coup, and I made it clear that Turkey could count on our solidarity and support. It was right and remains right that the Turkish authorities should investigate the crimes that were committed and prosecute those who are responsible. This is clear, but any action and measures must be in compliance with European Convention on Human Rights and within the limits of derogations stipulated therein. It is only through the guaranteeing of fundamental freedoms that national security efforts will actually result in real security for all. Likewise, in contexts and situations that are safe and secure, our fundamental freedoms can thrive and aid the further development of our democracies. It is for this reason that I continue to call on the authorities of Turkey to guarantee respect for the freedoms of all to express, to debate, and share diverse, pluralistic views. Freedom of expression must be extended to opinions that we disagree with, to views that may even shock, offend, or disturb us. With all of the above in mind, I will continue my work, cooperation with, and support for all of you to strengthen freedom of expression and media freedom in Turkey.
Freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, and the right to information are essential parts of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and cornerstones of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, laid down in Article 11. The first paragraph of Article 11 says, "Everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart informations and ideas without interference by public authorities and regardless of frontiers." The second paragraph states the freedom and pluralism of the media shall be respected. Without any doubt, both statements are crucial for peace, justice, and human rights for all. In my opinion, freedom of expression is not an abstract declaration of intent. Instead, it is a very real question of living in freedom, and it must never become a special privilege. Of course, there must be a general willingness to accept majority decisions, but it is everyone's right to state their opinion freely, even if the majority radically disagrees with it. However, there are certain legal limits of the freedom of speech, particularly when it conflicts with other rights and freedoms, even though these limits can be delicate. I'm convinced that they are necessary, for example, regarding incitement to discrimination, hate, violence, for example. However, freedom of speech and the progressive of accountability that follows it have a significant impact in the quality of governance of a country.
International or national NGOs have always been with us, beside us, since 1997, the first gathering. Now we repeat the same question and ask them, quo vadis?
Now, why do governments try to suppress free speech? It may be obvious, but I think that it's in the nature of governments to try to get what they can out of their power. They want to stay in power. They want to pad their bank accounts. They want to look after their friends. They want to do a number of things to serve themselves and their interests rather than the interests of the people whom they ostensibly serve. What's the impediment to their doing this? Freedom of expression, freedom of the media, people who can speak out openly about government misconduct. You know, we know that misconduct thrives in the shadows, that people behave better when they're watched, but they try to obscure the ability to watch, the ability to speak out, because that's when they can get away with things they're not supposed to be doing. And that's why we see governments going to such lengths to try to silence critics, to try to undermine journalists. It can be, sometimes journalists are actually killed. Other times they are imprisoned. Other times economic measures are used to try to, rein in, the newspapers or the media companies that employ them. There are various techniques that governments use, but all of them have the purpose of trying to prevent accountability to the public. And the way they do that is to try to silence those who want to exercise their right of free speech, to rein them in, to expose their misconduct. Now, there are certain important battle lines in this fight for free expression as we look around the world. I think very nearby to Turkey, there's Egypt, President Sisi, who has decimated the independent media. He has shut down independent civil society, and as a result, he is heading the most abusive government in recent memory, far more than the one that was overthrown in the Arab Spring. Or we have places like Philippines and Mexico, where journalists are actually murdered for exposing governmental misconduct, whether it's Duterte's summary executions or the abusive drug war in Mexico. We see, say, Prime Minister Orban in Hungary, who puts forward this concept of an illiberal democracy to justify constraining critics. You see Trump, who uses the term fake news to try to silence anybody who dares to criticize his government. And then, of course, there are places like China where there simply is no independent public criticism allowed, or Russia, where Putin has been using various forms of harassment to suppress freedom of expression. Now, Turkey in very many ways is on the front line of the battle for free expression. We're all aware that President Erdogan is trying to empower himself, create an imperial presidency, something like a new sultanship. We need a vigorous right of free expression respected and exercised in Turkey as the only way to preserve democracy, the only way to ensure accountable government. Now, Turkey in very many ways is on the front line of the battle for free expression. We're all aware that President Erdogan is trying to empower himself, create an imperial presidency, something like a new sultanship, in which he can rule over Turkey without any of the real checks and balances over his executive power. And obviously he has tried to shut down people who use their right of free expression to constrain him. Turkish society is very divided about this prospect. The AKP is divided. And so the public debate matters, which is why he is going to such great lengths to imprison the Cumhuriyet journalists, or to imprison leading political opposition figures, or to dismiss from their jobs anybody who is even vaguely associated with the Gulenists, whom he sees as obviously a major critic of his ongoing quest for power. So it's in this context, in this the midst of this real battle, that your conference is taking place. And the whole world is watching. We all recognize the enormous importance of free speech in terms of maintaining the pluralistic society and the real popular checks and balances on executive power that has enabled Turkey to thrive over the last decade plus, but which is at risk of being reversed as Erdogan proceeds with his quest to solidify power around himself. And so what you're doing really matters. We need a vigorous right of free expression respected and exercised in Turkey as the only way to preserve democracy, the only way to ensure accountable government. Without that, we are going to see Turkey descending into the same ugly past that we all know. And that's why the world really stands with you, and we view your battle for free expression as all of our battles for free expression. And the fate of democracy in Turkey today is really one of the most important issues for the human rights movement as we try to fight the waves of autocrats and populists who these days are trying to turn the table. So let me just say that I admire the conference that you're holding. I am completely with you in solidarity with your goals, and I wish you enormous success as you try to preserve the right to freedom of expression in Turkey, and indeed try to return Turkey to a vigorous democracy.
We tend to identify our era, our period, as a period of human rights crisis. We tend to conceptualize the world today as a world of crisis, whereas I think that we should challenge a little bit, which should attack a little bit the problematic of the crisis. I come from a country which has become the synonym of the term crisis over the last 8 years. And what I see over the last 3-4 years is the fact that what was conceived as a crisis initially has gradually become a part of a new regime, a new normality. So it is not anymore a crisis, if I might say, but it's a transition. It's a transition to an unknown destination, unlike what naive determinism of the right and of the left tend to believe. Transitions are always navigations in risk and not to safe ports. And I think this is the transition we're facing today in a big part of the world, including Europe, with some countries being at the forefront of the most of this storm. It's not a historical accident. In history, there is a very small, tiny place reserved for accidents. The rest, we deserve it. And I'm sorry to say, in a kind of cynical way, that we deserve what's happening. Not we, not us, but the political communities where we live. Because what is happening today in the world, this new shift versus totalitarianism, this new authoritarian regimes, this new neglect of rule of law and human rights, it's not the result of undemocratic expressions. It's not the result of a coup d'etat or putsches. It is the result of the legitimate expressed will of the majority of the people. So I think we should get familiar with this idea. Otherwise, our perception of fighting for freedom of expression, human rights, and fighting against censorship will always face the legitimate accusation of political elitism. So there are some people who tend to think about human rights where the majorities have other ideas. So what the dominant discourse does today in Europe, we tend to identify these majorities as populists. So we found the word populist, we found the basket of populism, and there we put everything that does not fit to our dominant idea of what is a rule of law, what is human rights, and so on. I think that is a great mistake, because we lose contact, we lose passion, and we become like these European bureaucrats that speak in a loveless, dry way about human rights, about big principles, but they speak in a way that you barely take 5 minutes to listen to them, and then you sleep. Whereas if you listen to leaders of the other side of the coin, the so-called populists, so if you listen to the line which unites different people, such as the oligarch president of the United States with the old KGB president of Russia, with the president of Turkey, with the president of Philippines, with the Hungarian prime minister, with maybe the new right in Europe, what you see that these people speak with an expression which addresses directly feelings and passions of the people. And this is something we've lost. This is the fight we've lost. So I think that we need to rethink, we need to regain space in this fight. And I consider that freedom of expression is one of the most serious fronts, one of the most consolidated fronts where this battle could be taken. Yet, the shift towards an agenda which regards human rights, rule of laws, and institutions as an unreasonable luxury, not to say an internal enemy, is a common trend which unites different governments of this planet, different governments of the North and of the West, and different governments who actually play an important role in this transition. I finish by saying that against all odds of determinism and of naive perceptions of determinism and of messianic perceptions of history, history is an open question. We do not know whether this transition is going to go, and it's a subjective question. It's an issue related to collective responsibility. It's an issue related to our project to change.
When I first attended the gathering years ago, I found a vibrant, dynamic meeting place focused on freedom of expression. Activists, journalists, academics, and artists from around the world met with Turkish colleagues to share ideas, strategies, even the odd glass of wine in friendship. We spent a few days together in Istanbul talking about freedom of expression, building important relationships, and leaving with new friends and ideas, energized to continue our important work together. That was then. Now is different. We have to admit the existing state of emergency has had an impact, creating an atmosphere that makes this gathering a bit unique, for reasons you're all well aware of. While many of us could not be there in person with you in Turkey, this gathering is still an attempt to bring people together, virtually and in person. Those who care and are aware of how the current situation in Turkey poses threats for freedom of expression, and those who would champion this important right. IFEX is a global network of over 119 organizations engaged in actively defending and promoting freedom of expression in over 80 countries around the world. Our members are fierce and experienced advocates, and as part of a network, they're in a position to learn from each other's experiences, successes and failures, that help us all become more informed and better equipped to do the hard work it takes to support those who suffer from crackdowns on freedom of expression, draconian laws, and even threats and violence for raising their voices to ask the hard questions. In Turkey, our members, the Initiative, Bayonet and P24 are key in helping provide IFEX colleagues with updates on the situation in the country and the critical direction on how we can best express our solidarity with them. Of course, in this case, it becomes even harder for us when our own members find themselves up on spurious charges by the government, facing spaces of damning accusations, postponements, appeals, and imprisonments. We're all aware that when we know the actual people behind the bars, there's yet another level of concern and motivation that's personal. And with so many Turkish journalists, academics, activists, and others facing trial and imprisonment, we cannot underestimate the toll this takes on their friends, families, and colleagues who seek justice. It takes a national toll. The IFEX network is committed to free expression and understands how its erosion can be a disaster for human rights. We just have to look today at the cast of leaders around the world whose greatest fear is to be contradicted, challenged, or held accountable. We know who they are and what lengths they'll go to stifle those voices that are contrary to their own. You can just imagine how threatening a vibrant civil society can be to them, and why there are so many examples today of their efforts to shut them down, curb their activities, neutralize their leadership, introduce bans, and freeze funding in attempts to shutter and paralyze these groups. We see it in countries like Egypt and Hungary, where any support from colleagues around the world, financial or otherwise, is being criminalized and cutting off not only important funding, but also well-established, meaningful, and professional relationships. We know a free and independent media is key to a healthy democracy. Our campaign for World Press Freedom Day this year was "One side of a story is never enough," calling for press freedom in order to hold those in power accountable. The question of why so many journalists are in jail for doing their job is because exposure and accountability can be terrifying for the likes of some of these leaders. Trump, Duterte, and Orban are actively calling the media liars or worse, denigrating the profession very, very publicly at every turn, and this has had a huge global impact. As we've witnessed, Turkey is among those countries we see taking full advantage of the global climate and imprisoning journalists and diminishing the power of independent media at every turn. I will admit, as a result of the current context, some of the traditional points of influence we've had in the past have shifted. Now, where best to address our pleas for support to broker change, shame those who would deny human rights, or rise with us to the demands for reform, protection of journalists, or release of those imprisoned? It isn't evident, and we're finding there are fewer places where appeals for action are actually ever met with action. What this means is that we have to become more dogged in our campaigns, explore new alliances to find new points of leverage, and be creative in developing effective campaign techniques in Turkey and everywhere. These crackdowns all serve to scare, silence people, and erode dissent. It might work sometimes, but in many cases, it just fuels the very opposite among others. And we know who we are, and we've had deterrents before, and we've met them head on. We might be a bit tired of it all at times, I'm sure we all are, but we also know resistance takes persistence. There will be victories, some small, some major, but every step is significant. When I think about it, the relationships and experience born out of crisis and resistance are often those stronger and more entrenched than ever. What I can say for IFEX is that among our members we have many groups committed to supporting efforts of Turkish groups during this period. We want to keep solidarity trending, and the networks have been front and center in their work on this. We've seen the RSF protests, the IPI subscriptions campaign, PEN and IPI missions to Turkey, Article 19, PEN Norway, and PEN International also monitoring trials. We're currently looking for ways to get more attention to the Academics for Peace movement, as well as other segments of Turkish society whose expression rights are being violated. So while there's still a state of emergency in Turkey, let's hope those of us engaged in this gathering will use this as an opportunity to share what we know, in the hopes that the state of emergency does not become the normal state of affairs. And let's remember, this is a marathon struggle. It's not a sprint. And IFEX and our members intend to remain with you all in solidarity for the long haul.
I've been asked to speak about the panorama of freedom of expression in the world today, so I would like to focus on the wider global picture and how this relates to the situation in Turkey. The shocking catalogue of harassment, imprisonment and attacks on journalists in Turkey and globally is testament to the level of impunity, creating a vicious cycle of continued intimidation and self-censorship. In the digital realm, the question of who controls information has become one of the leading issues of our time, while surveillance and the loss of privacy are becoming an equally concerning chill on freedom of expression. However, the news is not all bleak. There are growing calls for greater transparency the world over, including in Turkey. Once again, it is technology that is fueling this revolution, giving us all access to information on an unprecedented scale. WikiLeaks, Edward Snowden, the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers have contributed to transforming our expectations of open democracy, putting pressure on governments to be accountable. Similarly, there is progress in the digital space as human rights are being increasingly incorporated into technology standards and online tools. Turkey reminds us on an almost daily basis about the threats faced around the world to freedom of expression. We must accordingly invest ourselves with renewed energy in the defence and promotion of expression. We are witnessing a time when governments worldwide are retreating from commitments to human rights. Freedom of expression is often the first casualty, as we see in Turkey. Censorship in the name of national security, new laws to protect us from offensive speech, and unprecedented surveillance of our private communications. It's thus more important than ever to remember why the protection of freedom of expression is an essential condition of our liberty, enabling us to participate in public life, enjoy private life, and to hold the powerful to account. Without freedom of expression, all our other rights are at risk.
But in the past decade, we've noticed a serious decline in free expression globally and media freedom more generally, and in particular in countries where we thought that democratic gains had been made. We have seen cartoonists arrested places like Malaysia. We have seen satirists facing jail in countries like Spain. And even here in the UK, just last month, we saw a YouTube comedian fined for making a joke about his dog. These are difficult times for free expression. This is the time when free expression organisations need to stand together in support of individuals and groups fighting against censorship and fighting against threats to media freedom. And I think we do that best by understanding that this is not a political issue, but an issue of principle. We believe genuinely that free expression is a universal freedom, something that benefits all of us. It is not a freedom that benefits only the rich, the privileged and powerful. It is what enables all of us to hold those people to account. And it's absolutely vital at a time when we see the space for civil discourse, for civil society shrinking, that we raise our voices up even more loudly in support of those who are having their voices taken away. Index runs a project called Mapping Media Freedom, where we document threats to media freedom in Europe, neighbouring countries and EU candidate countries. In the past 4 years, the highest number of violations of media freedom have been recorded in Turkey. In addition to our work monitoring media freedom and recording those threats, we campaign against them, and we actively try to publish work not just about the threats faced by journalists, but the threats faced by all those in Turkey: academics, artists, actors, playwrights, authors. We stand in solidarity with all those facing threats to free expression, and in particular, we want to express our solidarity and our support for all of those facing threats to their free expression in Turkey.
When we at Freedom House look at the global picture for freedom of expression, what we see is mounting pressure against media independence in every region of the world. But we also see that dedicated journalists are still playing a vital role, even in the most hostile environments, like in Turkey. One of the major changes of the last 5 years has been the rise of an assertive, open, illiberal populism in Western Europe and in the United States that is threatening free expression in our societies. I think we understand now better in our own countries what it means when leaders attack the press, not only as unfair, but treasonous or criminal, and how those attacks prepare the ground for attacks on other pillars of democracy, like the judiciary. The severity of this pressure varies from country to country, but the goal is always the same: to prevent the press from serving as a check on power. We've seen dominant parties consolidating control not just over public media, but also over private media by controlling the process of procurement or through corrupt deals that favor certain companies in exchange for favorable coverage. I think everyone in Turkey is probably familiar with this story. We've seen individual politicians encourage or even engage in violent acts against individual journalists, as happened during an electoral campaign in Montana last year, here in the United States. At the same time, the power of journalism has never been clearer. Journalists have broken stories that have brought down governments, brought down individual ministers, as happened earlier this year in Slovakia, when the murder of an investigative journalist who was examining ties between Italian organized crime and politicians brought down the prime minister. We've seen stories that save lives, as was the case with the reporting of Yelena Milashina in Russia about pogroms against gay men in Chechnya. There's no question journalism matters. That's why people go to such lengths to try to suppress it. I think everyone in Turkey knows this. I'm not saying anything that you aren't already intimately familiar with.
For the gathering in Istanbul, it was suggested that we look at freedom of expression around the globe, not just in Turkey. My general observation is that the world itself is reversing directions from 20 years ago, when many of us thought that authoritarianism would be yielding globally to democracy and freedom. The situation in my own country, the United States, is more fraught than it has been in my lifetime in the relationship between the government and the media. But the press is protected in the U.S. by the U.S. Constitution, by laws, by history, and by society. The majority of U.S. citizens still remain committed to protect freedom of expression. I fear, however, that we are preoccupied with our own challenges sometimes, to the exclusion of much more dire challenges around the world. I also fear that we've lost credibility and impact when we speak out. I first visited Turkey for the inaugural gathering in Istanbul in March 1997. At the time, I was chair of PEN International's Writers in Prison Committee and was joined by 21 other writers from around the globe. We, along with over 1,000 Turkish writers and publishers, had signed on to be, quote, publishers for the volume Freedom of Thought, a book which reissued articles which had run afoul of Turkey's laws against, quote, insulting the state. The book included work by noted authors, including Yasser Kemal. None of us aspired to go to prison in Turkey, but we understood the importance of showing up and showing solidarity with our Turkish colleagues. During that gathering, we visited prisons where writers and publishers were incarcerated, and we visited courtrooms where they were being charged. In the subsequent decade, conditions for writers in Turkey have improved. An amnesty was called. Some of the oppressive legislation was replaced, though with other articles in the penal code. But the climate that opened, which we took hope in, seems to have closed again.
We are living today in a world which I would like to express as a paradigm shift. Many people feel a general fear for the future, which is not connected with any Cold War or any specific enemy, but as something which is more general. And I think this fear has to do with the fact that we feel uncertain. All over the world, people are feeling more uncertain and more afraid about the future than in modern times. This has to do with all the different threats which are confronting us. Threats from political systems, threats from climate, threats from economic falling apart. And all this together has created an atmosphere where populists and people with easy solutions to complex problems has got a forum. We see this in several countries where democratic system is not based on solid ground. Countries who have been fighting for a long time to obtain a stable, free society. Turkey is a country who has actually everything in place to become a full-feathered, functioning democracy. Unfortunately, Turkey is today perhaps one of the most oppressive systems in the world, and taking into consideration that they are also a multi-party system, this is extremely worrying. It's a new kind of dictatorship. It's a new kind of horror regime, which is based on the grounds of a advanced society. But when it comes to an end, it is a system where freedom of expression has been falling totally apart and has stopped functioning, I would say. Of course, one of the main and most important parts of the society is always the legal system. When a legal system is just becoming a jungle, becomes a parody, when people stop understanding that the state, the government, those who are conducting them, is not anymore interested in justice, interested in the rules of their own country even, and openly playing with the freedoms you, according to the Constitution, should be granted, then a very dangerous situation occurs in the country. Then different parts of the country becomes enemies in between each other, and you have in theory, I would say, a civil war situation. This is what has happened in Turkey, in my opinion. And this is the most worrying and the most tragic which has happened during especially the last 4 or 5 years. And after the so-called coup, which I insist calling a so-called coup, due to the fact that it was totally amateurish and was immediately used by the government for their own purposes. After that, Turkey has gone in one direction: more oppression, more censorship, more unbelievable sentences. People are put to jail for nearly nothing. In the end, they've even been put to jail for what they have not said. This is some kind of a new record. What has happened this time with our gathering, which we have had from the end of the 90s up to now, is significant for the situation. For the first time, it has been impossible to have a gathering in Istanbul. Nobody dared to open their locations, to no institution, no university, even no hotel was willing to give space for the gathering. So the result is that I have to speak to you like this today. And that is, in my opinion, the ultimate proof of the tragedy which is going on in Turkey today.
It is with sadness that not only I cannot be with you in person, but that the 11th gathering must be virtual. At the same time, I must say that the Turkish publishing community is an inspiration to the international community for the way that you are continuing to promote and defend freedom of expression and especially freedom to publish. That you are holding this virtual gathering is a testament to your tenacity. The freedom to publish is one of IPA's two pillars. The challenges that you are facing today demonstrate perfectly why it is an essential part of our mandate and why the IPA fully supports the activities of the Turkish Publishers Association. We are committed to raising the international profile of your struggle and providing a platform for Turkish publishers to share their first-hand experiences with a worldwide audience. In an age when blogs, social media, self-publishing platforms empower anyone to become a publisher and say whatever they want, many ask whether we can really fear for freedom to publish. The situation in Turkey shows how broad and violent repression can be. The publishing industry lies at the junction of business, culture, ideas, science and democracy. Your struggle is vital to so many aspects of life for Turkish citizens. You must continue and we must continue to support you. With that, I hand over to Kristen Einarsson, the chair of our Freedom to Publish Committee.
As you know, last year's Prix Voltaire, which is the IPA's Freedom to Publish Prize, was awarded to Turan Günay and publishing house Evrensel. Unfortunately, Turkey is the country most represented by the recipients of the Prix Voltaires in all the years since the creation of the prize. You must know that we will not forget these recipients. We will not forget you. We must continue to promote both the personal plights of the Prix Voltaire recipients and the disastrous freedom of expression situation in Turkey. We are with you.
Over the past few years, we have observed an increasingly repressive situation in many countries. Most concerning for us are those countries where only a few years ago we were looking at positive development, we are looking at journalists and free expression advocates being able to carry out their work more freely in the interest of their societies. And I'm thinking at countries around Europe, such as Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, the Balkans, and certainly Turkey, where this important gathering is taking place today. The last few years, we have, however, monitored an increasingly repressive situation also in these countries. And many of our contacts, many of the journalists and free expression advocates we have been working with have been increasingly challenged in their ability to carry out their work. In countries like Hungary and Poland, for example, the state is clamping down on free expression, ever more to the point that today we wonder whether there is any pluralistic information available to the people. In Turkey, certainly with over 150 journalists in prison and many more journalists and free expression advocates being prosecuted, the situation is not easy. And which is why we admire immensely the work of the Initiative for Freedom of Expression, of individuals like Shanar and many others in Turkey who are working to keep free expression alive in spite of the constant harassment they are facing. IPI will always support your work. We are here to defend your rights to free expression because these are in the interest of the people of your country. And without people like you, without civil society organizations like yours, IPI's work would not be possible.
Herkes diyorlar ki Avrupa dinlemiyor. Türkiye'nin sorunlarını, davaları, AİM'ye başvuruları dinlemiyorlar. Bir şey olmuyor. Ben size şunu demek istiyorum. Avrupa dinliyor. Avrupa çok iyi biliyor. Parlamentosu biliyor, Avrupa Komisyonu da biliyor. Bir de AİM kendileri de 10 binlerce davadan haberdarlar tabii. Bizim önerimiz onlara bu davaların bazı örnek davaları hakkında kararlar vermektir. O örnek kararlar da Türkiye'de uygulanabilecek ve bu şekilde daha etkin ve daha çabuk bir çözüm olabilir. Yani bütün hapisteki yazarlar için, hapisteki gazeteciler için. Biz bu süreçte devam edeceğiz ve daha kapsamlı bir şekilde davaları gözlemlemek istiyoruz. Ayda İstanbul dışında da Ankara'da, Diyarbakır'da, Van'da ayda 25-30 tane dava gözlemlemek istiyoruz. Bu veriler bir araya getirip onları Avrupa İnsan Hakları Mahkemesi'ne ve Avrupa Konseyi'ne sunmak istiyoruz ki görsünler ve biz bunu ispat etmek istiyoruz ki hukuk üstünlüğü kalmadı Türkiye'de. Onu kabul etmek zorundalar ve bu örnek davalarda karar verirlerse umarım daha etkin ve çabuk bir şekilde bu çözüme ulaşabileceğiz.
I would like you to know that we know within the European Federation of Journalists that it's really crucial to show solidarity with colleagues in Turkey, considering the current situation in the country. And I want you to know that you can count on our commitment, the commitment of the European Federation of Journalists, to protect journalists and to protect any media freedom defender in the country. Despite the pressure, the increasing pressure from local national authorities, we are developing our support program through several EU projects in the country, several projects involving our Turkish affiliates, TGS, TGC and Disk Basinis. We'll develop in the coming months, in the coming years, several support actions. You can also count on us to continue to follow closely the situation of imprisoned journalists. That's something we are following closely. In a few words, I can conclude with these words. You can count on us. The EFJ will always stand by you.
I think the one way to get at this question of what is the state of freedom of the press around the world is to look at the data. And one important data point is that last year, at the end of last year, there were 262 journalists in prison around the world. That's the highest number we've ever recorded. The second highest number we've ever recorded was the year before, 259 journalists. So obviously we're in record territory. So why is that? Why are we seeing journalists being jailed in record numbers around the world? I think in order to understand that, you need to go back to 2001 and the onset of the War on Terror. In the previous decade, between the end of the Cold War and 2001, we've really seen an explosion in independent media around the world and in expanding press freedom in many countries which had been subject to direct censorship and state-controlled media. And so there was a sort of upward trajectory. And then you have to keep in mind at the end of 2000, there were 81 journalists in jail around the world. We saw the coordinated attacks of September 11th and the declaration of the War on Terror, if you will. And then after that, we saw the emergence of a new framework for repression. By the end of the following year, the number of journalists in jail was up to 112, and we've been on a steady upward trajectory ever since. What's happened is that there emerged in the context of the War on Terror a new framework for repression. Journalists were accused if they covered groups that governments deemed to be terrorists of being terrorists themselves. And so most of the journalists jailed around the world are imprisoned on state security charges, in many cases related to supposed connections to terrorism or terrorist groups. That's certainly the case in Turkey.
freedom of expression is in decline in a considerable number of countries today. That's very worrying. And especially worrying is it that this happens in democracies, Poland, Hungary, Turkey and others. And Turkey's position was even reduced from 155th to 157th place out of 180 countries in Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Index for 2018. More than 250 journalists and media workers are now jailed in this country alone, making Turkey one of the worst places for freedom of expression in the world today. And recently, Freedom House's latest global report on press freedom was released. It shows another year of reductions in the degree of freedom in a number of countries. And this has been a tendency for a decade now. And in surprising places too, as I mentioned, that we wouldn't have guessed 15 years ago. Countries which not many years ago were promising democracies. For example, Hungary, Poland and Turkey. Increasingly nationalist and authoritarian regimes are behind what is happening. It almost seems like the slogans are something like Hungary first, Poland first, or make Turkey great again. The worrying fact is that this more long-term tendency folds itself out, accompanied by what we have seen the last couple of years also in Europe and the US. Attacks on science from influential political leaders for being politicized and ideological. And the same leaders attack journalism and established media for being ideological, true, and for producing fake news themselves. And it works, sadly enough. The vicious attacks leave an impression on people in the public. The latest digital news report from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford found a high level of skepticism about news and comment, with 33% of more than 70,000 consumers in 36 countries saying they can't rely on the news to be true. But they trust social media even less than mainstream media. The shared traits to be found in all of this are the repeated, systematic and destructive anti-institutional and anti-elite campaigns, with a disregard of facts and a disregard of the standards of rational discussions. In the worst case, conspiracy theories flourish and gain new ground. In the best case, there is a revitalizing of important and serious journalism and political activism. And we see both tendencies at the present time. Social media play a key role in these processes. They have both a strongly negative and a positive influence on free speech. It is so much easier to influence directly without being filtered through editors. But fake news are also spread effectively, so are hate speech and conspiracy theories. But at the same time, Facebook, Twitter and others have created new, vast public spaces for billions of people. Pretty egalitarian and open, but directed of course by subtle algorithms. And the accumulated knowledge and the power of these tech giants is very scary. Mainstream media have mostly succeeded in combating hate speech. Digital social media have not. Hate is directed against women, ethnic and religious minorities, people with disabilities and sexual minorities. And one particular challenge is all the threats against vulnerable, free voices and independent thinkers. Especially in discussions on immigration, integration, Islam, climate, gender issues, conspiracy theories flourish on the web, in social media. And they have a considerable following too. In 2004, 78% in 7 Muslim countries said that they didn't think Arabs were behind 9/11, but the US or Israel. And in 2012, 1 of 5 Norwegians answered that Jews work in hidden, secret ways for Jewish interests. End of quote. And in 2013, as many as 37% of Americans thought climate changes were a lie and a bluff. I fear this tendency. To take away someone's freedom to speak only polarizes and sharpens conflicts. It stops discussions, ends conversations and arguments, in the same way as cultural and academic boycotts do. Irrationalism and illiberalism gain ground under cover of good intentions. And where the free word is blocked, hate grows.
We can notice, and you also know this in Turkey, because unfortunately Turkey is a sort of laboratory for all violations of press freedom. You have a president who targets journalists, but you also have a system where more and more there is a capture of media outlets by oligarchs who wants to support the president and reduce step by step and very quickly pluralism. Really important that there are such gatherings as the one you organize in Istanbul, even through new technologies.
The recollection of the horrors of war and inhuman degradation is fading in spite of warnings from the previous generations. Religion, extremism, political obsession, fear of their own people, cruel hatred and malice are promoted everywhere. Keywords such as Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, ISIL, the Taliban, and many more bring chills down our spines. In extreme cases, the situation triggered by the critical words or the missing words are often reinforced by self-censorship and corruption. We say this to each other dumbfounded, but in many ways helpless. Dumbfounded because we should have learned from our recent history and recent history terrors. Is it true that the memory of the atrocities since World War II, with all its Holocaust, nuclear bombs and mass killings, are fading, and that new generations have not learned? Could it be possible? But do we sense some hope these days, even if a movement from below is still invisible? We are frightened that neo-fascism can take hold. It can happen fast. We see how undemocratic tendencies are spreading across Europe. And what does Brexit really signify? What will a new president of the US bring to the table in the end? What's gone astray when bestial violence and terrorism constantly dominate our news? Everything from decapitation, slaughter with machete, car bombing, massacres with automatic weapons, often executed by suicide and suicide martyrs who believe in a privileged life eternal. International leadership, organizations and superpower must take the blame. They have failed us in preserving a peace-promoting dialogue in a world with tremendous challenges and changes. Democratic governing methods have long been lacking in many places. Knowledge of cultural differences is apparent. It has led to crisis and atrocities instead of respect of our differences in our world.
And our very special guest, dear Professor Noam Chomsky, once again among us.
Turkey has suffered through miserable periods, most recently in the 1990s, years of vicious state terror directly primarily against the Kurdish population, years of slaughter and destruction, a huge flood of refugees, harsh repression. But the flame of resistance to oppression and violence was kept alive, not only among the victims who refused to bow to cruel force, but also by a most remarkable groups of intellectuals and activists, writers, journalists, artists, publishers, academics, and others. The forces of justice and freedom remain determined and committed, and will enable Turkey to renew its impressive march towards the high ideas that were coming to prevail before the current regression set a few years ago.
Tarihi tekerrür diye tarif ediyorlar. Hiç ibret alınaydı, tekerrür eder miydi? Lines of a great poet, Mehmet Akif, the lyrics writer of our national hymn, which reads, "They define history as a repeat. Will it ever repeat if people took lessons from it?"
Yes, we have to take lessons. For example, from the story of the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany.
In May 1925, the Nazi Party had only 2.6% of the votes and 12 seats in German parliament. The years between 1925 and 30 was the period of Hitler's paramilitary groups, SA, storm divisions, systematic attacks on the Roth front, Red Front, by marching into communist strongholds. Hitler was able to persuade German capitalists that Nazi Party was the only power to stop communism and protect their property and gain their support. In September 1930, Nazi votes raised up to 18.3%, 107 seats, and in July 1932, 37.3%, the strongest party at the parliament. On January 1933, Hitler was the chancellor. The turning point was the Parliament fire on 27 February 1933. It is still unclear who did it, but it gave Hitler the opportunity to blame and imprison communist leaders. It also allowed the Nazis to say that the country was in the danger of a communist revolution. The rest went so quickly. One great race, Aryans. One great nation, Germans. One flag, the Nazi swastika, and one Führer, Adolf Hitler. Judiciary, media, universities, unions, chambers, churches, all must serve the German nationalist ideology, not only in politics, but in all areas of life, including literature, music, visual arts. Even the role of women in the society was framed with 3 Ks, Küche, which means kitchen, Kinder, children, and Kirche, the church. All different ideas were banned, books burned. Jews had to face again a common pogrom on the Crystal Night, 9 to 10 November 1938, then step by step to concentration camps where communists, socialists, unionists, and other dissidents were already sent. Pastor Martin Niemöller's lines tell everything clearly. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me at last, and there was no one left to speak for me.
We have a guest historian from Germany, Professor Thomas Kuhne. Will you please tell us how it could happen in the country of Goethe, Schiller, and Beethoven?
Germany was a democracy in the 1920s. Technically, still in 1932 and January 1933, when Hitler eventually formally came into power. And the fact that Hitler could rise is not a result of the popularity of his ideology and propaganda. It is also a result of the inability of the democratic parties, party leaders, to prevent the rise of Hitler. The Nazi Party or Hitler in person never gained a majority in the general vote, in the popular vote. Yeah? From 1930 on, and even 1932, there were two elections in Germany. One that provided the Nazi Party with 33% and the other with 37%. That made the Nazi Party the strongest party in Germany and in the parliament. But still, it is not a majority. Democratic parties in Germany, especially the centrist parties, were still in power. They still had a majority in the German national parliament, the so-called Reichstag. For Hitler, it was a gift. The Reichstag fire was a gift because it allowed him to basically abolish the German constitution and the constitutional rights of and the parliamentary system, the democracy, the remnants of the democracy in Germany. At that time, Hitler already had governed basically by ignoring the parliament, but he needed a final step to establish a dictatorship, and that was the so-called Enabling Act, which formally abolished the democratic constitution in Germany. But this Enabling Act, actually passed the parliament. It was a law, and it was supported even by centrist parties in Germany, of many liberals and center and democratic forces in Germany and politicians. They thought after a couple of weeks or months, the Hitler administration would somehow fall apart. And then there would be a chance to reconstruct democracy in Germany. As we all know, this was an illusion, but that motivated that based the passivity and indifference of the Democratic Party leaders in Germany in spring 1933. So that needs to be kept in mind. It's not that the rise of Hitler was kind of an automatic process that could not have been stopped. It could have been stopped.
How was he able to control the judiciary?
That took a while. What in German was called, the basis, not the actual fact. The basis, the context. We have to look at the context, the political context. That was accompanied by what in German is called Gleichschaltung. The political system, the political arena, meaning parliaments, national parliament, but also regional parliaments, state parliaments, and even local parliaments, coordinated, that's a literal translation, so that the Nazi Party would have majorities or control all these parliaments in total. That happened between spring and summer 1933. It would be wrong to assume that, let's say, by 1935 or 1938 or even 1941, all judges in Germany had been Nazis. That was not the case. But previously, let's say, liberal or other non-Nazi judges, they gave up. They basically gave up opposition to Hitler. 1938. That's the Kristallnacht. That is already one of the climaxes of Nazi terror in Germany against Jews in this case. That is a long process during which the Nazis increasingly terrorized the German society, the Jews in particular, but not only the Jews, the communists, the socialists, and other.
How about the role of the press? Was it under control totally?
The press and the radio. The radio indeed was almost perfectly under control of the Nazis and the Goebbels propaganda ministry. Yeah? Even during the war, there were liberal newspapers. I mean, that were not controlled completely by the Nazis. Yeah? I mean, they had limited options to speak up against the Nazis and the anti-Jewish policy and so on and so forth. They had very limited options, but I mean, they could publish articles that, let's say, between the lines. There were choices, there were options in Nazi Germany to articulate anti-Nazi opinions. All of these choices were limited, and the way this would happen was indirectly. Yeah? But Germans, I mean, readers of the Frankfurt Zeitung, for instance, did get the message. They understood what the paper wanted to tell them.
What was the role of the church, Catholic and Protestant?
Sad chapter of German history, because neither of the two major denominations, Protestants and Catholics, may not have welcomed Hitler, the Nazi party, but they welcomed the nationalist agenda of the Nazi party. The promise of Hitler to re-establish German power, military power, and so on and so forth. Yeah, this all was welcomed by major parts of the Protestants in Germany and the Protestant churches. There was not only one, as you know. The Catholics, it's a different issue. The Catholics were, most of them, in 1933, anti-Nazi. But Hitler was very smart in that regard. He agreed, he negotiated with the Vatican, with Rome, a so-called concordat that implied that the Nazi state, the Nazi dictatorship, would basically not touch the Catholic infrastructure, the Catholic Church, yeah, as long as the Catholic Church would not articulate publicly critique of the Nazi regime. The Germans did have choices when Hitler came into power, the rise of the power, and after, but that they didn't take the choices against Hitler.
After the end of World War II, the United States found itself in an ideological conflict with its former allies. As the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States intensified hysteria over the perceived threat posed by communists in the United States became known as the Red Scare. The President Truman had signed on March 21, 1947, an executive order to screen federal employees to alter the form of government of the United States by unconstitutional means. In the next month, the Republican-led House UN-American Activities Committee began a determined campaign to extirpate communist subvention at home. The film industry investigations reached their peak with the events surrounding the Hollywood 10, a group of writers and directors who were called to testify in October 1947.
Professor Kristen Williams is a political scientist from America. Let us ask her now, how could such a madness capture American society in early 50s?
This in large part is a result of the end of the World War II, when the United States obviously won the war, and people realized with the emergence of the Cold War and fear of communism. And so Americans were very, very concerned that there was a communist presence within America by Americans. And this begins effectively, as you called it, the witch hunt, but begins the Red Scare. And so people were afraid, especially after they saw that the Soviets had detonated a nuclear bomb in 1949. The Chinese communists had taken over and won the Civil War in 1949 in China and established the People's Republic of China. And then, of course, the North Koreans invaded South Korea and began the Korean War. So all of these external events made Americans very worried that communists were in their midst as well. And this fear of communism led to the Red Scare. As a result of these concerns, the Truman administration, so Truman's now the president, and in 1947, so just 2 years after World War II ended, he signed an executive order that led to what's called the Federal Employee Loyalty Program. And all federal employees, both current and prospective employees, were then going to be investigated to whether or not they were loyal or disloyal to the United States. And this loyalty program that began in 1947 for the federal government level actually was instituted by state and local governments and some universities and labor unions. So you see this going throughout all of American society, this concern about disloyalty to the United States and the idea of communist infiltration. Back in 1938, the United States Congress had established what's called the House Un-American Activities Committee. And by in the 1940s, it was really concerned about what Americans, if there were disloyal Americans. And so the Congress then sets up a series of hearings that basically brings people in. They could subpoena people to come and speak to Congress and be investigated to find out whether or not they were subversives and whether or not they were communists. And therefore, many of them ended up, just to the fear of it, even if there wasn't any evidence that proved that they were actually communists or subversives, people would lose their jobs. So there's a real chilling effect in America. People could lose their jobs and their livelihood, and they couldn't get hired again for any job. So then they had no employment. They couldn't feed their families and support themselves. February of 1950, he was attending a meeting at the Ohio County Women's Republican Club in West Virginia, and he held up a piece of paper and he declared that he had the names of 205 people in the US State Department who were basically members of the Communist Party. And this really begins the Red Scare and what we call the McCarthy era. And what's interesting is that he didn't actually have this list. There was no such list. The State Department responded right away and said, no, this is not true. The US Senate investigated because the Senate Democrats demanded this. And this tells you a lot about partisanship. And I don't know if this is true in Turkey as well. But in the United States, it was very much about a Republican-led House Un-American Activities Committee that was calling for these hearings and supporting McCarthy and his actions. And what's interesting is that even though there was a Senate subcommittee that investigated McCarthy's claims about these 205 communists in the State Department, they found no evidence of that case. But what was interesting is the number of Republicans in the Congress who started to really support McCarthy, even though there was no evidence. And then, as I mentioned, that later in 1950, the Senate passed or Congress passed the Internal Security Act, which actually President Truman had vetoed. He was very concerned about the threat to this act to the Bill of Rights in the United States and the Constitution, but Congress overrode the veto. By some historians, that more than 11,000 people lost their jobs in local, state, and federal positions or private companies. And these people were allegedly disloyal. And so large numbers of people, but many more were actually investigated. And we're not talking small numbers in the population. How it all ended is the turning point happens in 1954. And what happens then is that McCarthy decides to expand his investigation beyond just people in the federal government to actually into the military. And so there's a series of hearings called the Army McCarthy hearings. And he is confronted and attacks actually the Army lawyer. His name is Joseph Welch. He is originally from Boston. And during these Army McCarthy hearings in April of 1954, McCarthy keeps going after Welch. And finally, Welch says this very famous line that people have probably heard of, maybe you've heard of it as well, where he says, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" And this becomes a real turning point. And why it's a turning point, too, is that the hearings are televised. And this matters for the American public because they're actually able to see through the televised hearings, McCarthy really intimidating witnesses and seeing what's happening in Congress. And so slowly but surely, the American public, turns against McCarthy and the red baiting. Fear is a very powerful political weapon. And when you can get enough people to be that frightened, and they will do things that undermine civil rights, freedoms, liberty, all these kinds of things. So absolutely there are parallels in the United States. Fear was a very potent political weapon. And what's interesting, in some ways different than the cases of Hitler that you just gave, for example, or Mussolini in Italy, is that this was non-violent political repression in the United States. So the fear can actually paralyze people, in essence, from challenging the government without even having to have major violence or coercive measures. Just the fact that people could be blacklisted from their jobs. So, for example, Hollywood writers were brought up in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee and denounced other people in Hollywood. They then get blacklisted. So people aren't going to speak out if they know that they're going to lose their jobs. As I mentioned before about the loyalty oath, if you now know that you have to take the loyalty oath, you're not going to say anything that remotely could be deemed or perceived as being disloyal to the government. This fear is very palpable and very real for people. But added to that, the fear as a political weapon, I think it's also important to keep in mind the role of the political institutions that allow this to happen. So as I mentioned before, the FBI in a surveillance capacity, the courts upheld these various acts and these various policies. And of course, Congress itself by passing legislation such as the Internal Security Act. All these institutions, even though we have the separation of powers, all three of them, the executive, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch, all acted actually to promote this, effectively, this red baiting and the anti-communist fervor and the scariness that was occurring, the fear, and they're playing on that fear. And the public listened to that, and the public responded as well. And so, in a more succinct way, I guess to say that you have fear as a very strong and potent political weapon.
Hitler's rise in Germany in 1930s and McCarthy madness in the USA in the 1950s. We can say that we also have seen this film before. Haven't we? Aren't we? Tomorrow at 14 hours Turkey time, 12 GTM, we will be here again, this time to discuss the situation in Turkey with witness and NGO representatives. Have a nice evening and a very good night.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord.